This evening we will be engaging on a very topical issue in this country and around the world in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this evening we have a very diverse panel who will speak to the heart of domestic violence. But before I begin, because I know that gender-based violence has been going on for quite some time in this country and around the world, I would just like for us to, before we begin, before we introduce the speakers, just take a moment of silence to honor and remember those women that we would have lost to this pandemic. So we're gonna take a moment of silence. And if you can just mute your microphone so we could honor the moment of silence, that would be great. Thank you all so very much. So to begin, I would just like for us to remember that after the presentations, we'll be taking questions, and just to respect the space and respect the views of others, we would like for you to raise your hand if you have a question. If it is that you have something that's really at the tip of your tongue, as we would say, and you would like to park that, if you can type it in the message or in the chat box, and we could get back to it. Because I know that as a discussion would flow, you might have something that you might want to say or share. So if it is that you can't wait, just type it in the chat box and we'll get back to it. If it's that you must speak, just raise your hand. We'll note it and we'll let you in. And I would appreciate as the speakers are present, if everyone could mute their microphones. If it is that you're using video and your internet connection is low, we would appreciate if you can take off your video because it really shows a bad connection. Great. So as I said, we have a very diverse panel this evening. And first up, we would like to introduce Ms. Akilah Dorris, who has a Master's of Social Work degree and 10 years of experience in social development. She works in the areas of gender-based violence, sexual and reproductive health rights, HIV/AIDS, and victim advocacy. She heads the policy unit at the Ministry of Public Health, the Ministry of Social Protection, Domestic Violence Unit, sorry. Second, we have Ms. Valini Leitch, who is an advocate for women's rights, a survivor of domestic violence. She is the Homophobia Education Program Coordinator at the Society Against Sexual Orientation Discrimination Guyana, that's SASAD Guyana. And she's also a member of the Guyana Responsible Parenthood Association Board of Directors. Next, we have Ms. Carlotta Boodie Walcott. She is a clinical psychologist who's passionate about educating and advocating for survivors of gender-based violence.
Hello.
As a psychotherapist, hello. Are we muting our microphones? I think that was the consensus that we had a few seconds ago. Yes, so as I was saying, Miss Carlotta is a psychotherapist where she uses a multi-pronged approach to provide non-judgmental healing spaces for adults to talk about their issues and to really find solutions for them. And last but certainly not the least, we have Mr. Nicholas Elliot. He's a final year medical student at the University of Guyana. He served as president of the University of Guyana Medical Students Association. He's also a member of the IDPADA-G Youth Committee. And for me, my name is Kobe Smith. I'm the president of the Youth Advocacy Movement of the Guyana Responsible Parenthood Association, and also a member of the IDPADA-G Youth Committee. So without further ado, I would like to invite Miss Akilah Dorris to share with us.
Thank you very much, Kobe, for your warm introduction. And good evening to all joining us and my other colleagues who are sitting on the panel. So I will get straight into the presentation this evening. So it seems as if, like the world over, there seems to be a new normal with respect to the COVID-19 crisis that we're all experiencing. And with this new normal, there is an inherent human cost as it relates to debts, as it relates to loss of assets, loss of property, loss of wealth, as it relates to the physical effects of the COVID-19 infections, and of course, the psychological and other forms of mental health trauma we're likely to face by this. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty about the COVID-19 crisis and not knowing how it will play out, not knowing when we will get back to a state of normalcy. And the fact that we are unable to see an end in the near future, this can create a whole lot of panic. This can create a whole lot of anxiety and fear among us. And we have been seeing this particularly when Guyana had its first case of infection. We saw persons panic buying. We saw persons trying to ensure that, they did everything possible not to, excuse me, not to become infected with the pandemic. And what's equally important is that there's a lot of information in the public's that is accessible to the public. However, there's a lot of misinformation, and it can become overwhelming after we process and we endure all this information. And this can heighten our fear, this can heighten anxiety. So with the COVID-19 crisis, as we all know, there are several effects, and the list that I'm going to be presenting this evening, it's not limited to this list, but we will, and you can feel free to interject. Now, there's a downside of the lockdown that we're experiencing, and of course, many of us can't wait until we resume normal operations. And the downside of this is that this can lead to a lot of traumatic stress, a lot of confusion and anger. And if we particularly are unaware of dealing and coping with all that's happening, this can have serious negative impacts. And of course, we're going to be talking about one such impact, and that is domestic violence. We know also that the lockdown or self-isolation, it's further exacerbated by the fear of infection. And we know also that there are limited supplies. We know also that there is inadequate information. We know also that there has been some economic loss. Persons have been forced to accept reduced wages, reduced income. Some persons have lost their jobs. And of course, we know there is a huge stigma attached to the COVID-19 infection particularly. And this stress, of course, can have many spin-off effects, resulting in alcohol and substance abuse, as well as domestic violence and other forms of family violence. We're a bit concerned because when we think in terms of effects, we first think in terms of vulnerable groups, and we know women and girls are a vulnerable group that we cannot emphasize more, that we need to ensure that we have protective measures in place and we are able to provide the essential services needed for them to be able to withstand everything that's happening. And they're at higher risk of violence. We know also persons who are within the LGBT community are vulnerable. We know persons with disabilities. We know our senior citizens. We know our children in particular are vulnerable. So as we are forced to adhere to social lockdown measures, tension can grow. Tension can grow particularly when persons are becoming infected within a household, and there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of stress. And this can create a situation for batterers or abusers to resort to violence. And we know that violence or abuse is learned behavior. We know it's a choice. So regardless of whether or not we're on lockdown, we cannot condone any form of violence. So we know that social distancing is one of the universal precautions. We know that school is out. We know that childcare facilities are closed. And we know this is causing a lot of additional pressures. This putting a lot of additional pressures on parents. Now parents are faced with the situation where they have to do homeschooling, have to manage working from home, they have to manage their children at home, notwithstanding the many challenges that they experience with their children and so forth. So women and girls are also at risk because of the lack of choices that might be available at this time, during this time, to leave abusive situations, because many times, and this is outside of COVID, many times the question is, where will I go? What would I do? Who is going to take care of me if I leave? And of course, we know that essential services might not be available readily at this point in time. So that further creates a challenge to access services. And when women and girls particularly are placed in this situation, and children particularly as well, they face two threats, and that is the threat of the actual COVID-19 and the possibility of becoming exposed or becoming infected, as well as having to coexist with batterers. So women particularly bear the brunt of increased care work during this time. And there's a lot of disruption of livelihoods and the ability to earn a living. And if we look within our informal sector in Guyana, women comprise a very large portion of the informal sector. And many of them, because of the restrictions of physical distancing and so on, and the lockdown that have now been extended to June, their income earning abilities have been reduced, and this can result in the stress that I've been talking about, and of course it can decrease their access to basic needs, and also conflict. This can contribute to conflict and violence within the home. So as resources become more scarce, women may be at a greater risk for experiencing economic abuse. And also during isolation or social lockdown, perpetrators, they may use the restrictions to exercise power and control over their partners in an effort to prevent them from seeking help, from seeking the support that they need to escape the abusive relationship. The perpetrators may also want to restrict access to necessary items such as the hygiene items, hand sanitizers and cleaning agents and so on. And they may also want to exert this control by spreading misinformation about the disease and of course, stigmatizing their partners. So we know that the care and support services for all forms of survivors of gender-based violence, particularly the clinical management of violence, mental health, and so on, law enforcement, judicial services, we know that they're currently strained because you may be aware that many essential service providers are not providing face-to-face services, for example, counseling. However, online counseling, telephone counseling is made available. And it leaves one to question if it is that the perpetrator or the abuser and the victim is at home, and they would have used going to the market, for example, as the opportunity to go and seek help, and now they can't leave their home, they're being controlled and overpowered, then we really have a situation on our hands here. And of course, we have a concern about the access to important sexual and reproductive health services. We are concerned about women who are pregnant and having to access these services. And we want to ensure that whatever efforts, we want to ensure that whatever our efforts are, meet or cater to these needs. So we're also concerned that following the crisis or after the crisis, when things appear to return to normal, women start going out of their homes and the abusers recognize that, you know, they're losing grip or they're losing control of their partners. The research shows us that this can lead to an increase where we see the victim being further abused, or it can result in a tragedy where the victim is actually killed. So what is the real face of domestic violence? And I'm going to try next couple of minutes to bring it home to Guyana. And of course, we know what the world statistic is. About 1 in 3 women, particularly within this region, at some point in their life would have experienced some form of violence at the hand of their current partner or their former partner. In 2018, the United Nations Women, along with the George Washington University and the University of Guyana, they partnered, and the IDB, they conducted the Guyana Women's Health and Life Experience Survey in Guyana. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. And it was startling to see, and this was a national survey, and the survey focused on the prevalence of intimate partner violence. And the finding of this survey suggested that 1 in 2 women in Guyana, they would have experienced some form of intimate partner violence throughout their lifetime. And at the time when the survey was conducted, there were over a third of Guyanese women within the past 12 months would have experienced either physical or sexual violence by the hands of their partner. So when we look at these stats, we recognize that for a very small country, we have extremely high rates of violence directed towards women, directed towards children. And that's why it seems as if there is a bias many times when we talk about violence against women and girls. Interestingly, the survey also revealed that 20% of our women, they've experienced non-partner sexual abuse in their lifetime. So this would be abuse directed towards them by somebody who is not their intimate partner, and it could be a total. This would constitute rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and so forth. 30% of Guyanese women also indicated that they would have experienced abuse before the age of 18, and we're very, very concerned because it's really showing us that we have to do more for our youthful population. And the survey also went on to reveal that the risk, just by being young, it increases your risk for non-partner sexual violence, which includes rape, just for being young. And we saw that coming out from the 15 to 24 age group, they would have reported physically higher rates of non-partner sexual violence of every type. So when we reflect on these statistics here, we have to be able to identify where and when and how and why our women and girls are having these experiences. We know that Guyana sexual harassment is very much alive. It's an area that we do not talk much about, and we really need to start talking a whole lot about this, because it begins with the harassment, it begins with calling, and then it can further escalate into the actual assault, the actual sexual assault or sexual abuse. And I know a lot of persons have been asking this question. has domestic violence been increasing since the COVID-19 pandemic? And the truthful answer is that we are not able to make this determination just yet. Of course, we are reliant on reports of domestic violence. There's no other way of us knowing that domestic violence is occurring unless it is reported. And reported to whom? Reported to the police, reported to agencies, NGOs that provide services to victims and survivors and so on. So when we did a preliminary overview, when we tried to have an understanding of what really happened within the first quarter of this year, 2020, we see that there are about 238 reports that the Ghana Police Force received. But this might not be a true reflection of all the reports because one, we're still waiting on police stations to submit their figures. Two, domestic violence is still underreported. A lot of persons do not report. And three, there are cases where even though the police has a zero tolerance policy, there are cases where the victim goes to the station, not necessarily for action, but for a warning to be given. January recorded the highest, and again, these are just preliminary figures to share with you. And as we're able to finalize these figures, we're going to make it public so that you can further scrutinize this. One good thing coming out of this is more than 60% of the reported cases that we're seeing resulted in the perpetrators being charged. So it's demonstrating that the police, they're doing their jobs. And there are many reasons why domestic violence cases do not result in charges. And one of the main reasons is that if the victim is not willing to cooperate and give evidence against the abuser, the police, it's very limited because mandatory reporting, we don't have mandatory reporting laws here in Guyana. So domestic violence, and most of you know of this, it's a pattern of coercive and controlling behavior. And at any point in time, any of us could become a victim or perpetrator of domestic violence. And we need to understand that and recognize it's about gaining power and control. One person seeing the other person as inferior and weak to them, and that person decides that they're gonna use the power to take the power from the other person and to gain control of that person. And it occurs across relationships, whether it's intimate, marital relationships, family relationships. So who are most at risk? We talked about this, persons with disabilities. And during this COVID crisis, persons with chronic diseases, because we know that persons with pre-existing medical conditions are more susceptible. And we know that older persons who might be in need of care and who may be neglected or overexposed to violence by their caregivers. We don't talk about elderly abuse, but elderly abuse is very much alive, as subtle as it presents itself. Children who are institutionalized, children without prenatal care, who might be unprotected during this time, migrants, refugees, they're all at risk. And they can become victims of sex trafficking and so on, because they have to survive, and with all the domestic restrictions at this point, they may be forced into performing all sorts of acts. Afro-descendant and rural women and children who might be isolated and cannot access service are all at risk of experiencing domestic violence. So I'm just going to touch briefly on some of the impacts here. And of course, we know violence against women and children can result in injuries and serious physical, mental, sexual, and reproductive health problems. We know of this. And this can also include sexually transmitted infections, HIV, unplanned pregnancies as well. We know that the COVID-19 and domestic violence can result in job losses and lower incomes, which can increase poverty and tensions within households. So when one partner loses their job without knowing how to manage that frustration and so on, this can spin off into domestic violence. For women and their children, it can be very difficult for them to leave the relationship at this point in time. And also, if we understand how perpetrators and abusers, they try to isolate you from any source of help. So the social lockdown that we're experiencing is the perfect opportunity for perpetrators, if I could say that, to utilize their power and control over you. And of course, as a serious impact could be on in terms of sexual exploitation of younger persons, early unions, as a result of women trying to gain access to food and so forth. So what has been the Ministry of Social Protection's response? We've implemented a 24-hour helpline system, and we have trained social workers and victim advocates who provide confidential services. We also provide safe shelters or temporary accommodations. As you know, domestic violence shelters, of course, we do not have a large number of shelters to accommodate persons, and we're limited to children under the age of 14 years. We do have an arrangement in place for male victims of domestic violence in terms of providing temporary accommodations for them. We're currently also providing telephone counseling. Of course, when you contact the helpline, the information is taken and a counselor contacts you to make the arrangements for the counseling sessions and so forth. And of course, we provide victim advocacy. We are aware that the court is still addressing matters of domestic violence and maintenance. There are some courts that are physically hearing these cases. Of course, they've reduced their hours of operation to about half day. And there are some other courts that are hearing matters via Skype and other audiovisual technology. So what can victims do during this time of self-isolation or quarantine? Reach out for help. We cannot emphasize more, reach out for help. And our helpline is toll-free. Our helpline is toll-free, so there is no cost attached to the person calling, and I will give you the numbers shortly. And we understand that during times like these, victims can feel isolated from their family, their friends, their co-workers, and we're recommending that they maintain social connections, whether it's via WhatsApp, whether it's via Facebook or Snapchat or any of the online sources. Contact the helplines, and we're trying to put a system in place where we can do call tracing as well as location tracing and so forth. So if you find yourself in an emergency where your partner or somebody is about to abuse you or they're abusing you, contact your nearest police station. In fact, the number of your nearest police station should be on speed dial in your mobile phone or hospital. If you're unable to do so, we have a mechanism in place via 2 of our toll-free numbers for you to WhatsApp us and let us know if you're not able to call and talk, and we can still get help to you. Safety planning is also important, and this is an area that the Ministry of Social Protection, the Domestic Violence Unit, can assist with this. And of course, if you call us via our helpline, what we try to do, because we try to have minimal disruption to victims' lives, we explore with them other opportunities for alternative accommodations rather than uprooting them and just placing them into the shelter. So think of at least another place that you can go, that you can be safe. We can assist with transportation and police and that kind of thing. Of course, victims need to be extra mindful of good hygiene practices and continue to adhere to all the universal precautions and self-care. This is very, very important. Yes, we know there's a lot of uncertainty for many of you, but you're encouraged to take time out for your health and ensure that the information that you're putting into your system, it's really helping you to develop emotionally and mentally. So how do you contact us? Our helpline is 227-0206. You can visit our website for more information. Also, these are our helpline numbers, rather, 640-1011, 640-1012, 24 hours, or you can drop us an email, or you can message us at our Facebook page, #CutItOut592. So I know I've said a whole mouthful, so do you have any questions? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akilah. So what we'll do, we'll take questions afterwards because of how we strapped for time.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Okay.
thank you so much for that. I really liked how you really hit the nail on how universal the impact of domestic violence is. It doesn't care if you're Indo-Guyanese, Afro-Guyanese, young, old, whatever. I was saying to a friend the other day that if you really look at domestic violence minutely, you'd understand that that is actually a pandemic, because it does not discriminate with age, gender. It does not care who you are. It causes death. And this public health crisis of the coronavirus exacerbates domestic violence. And I'm really glad that you would have brought the research and the evidence, but also to share the government's response to this issue. So thank you so much for that, Akilah. And I know that we've been having some questions in the chat box, but we'll get to those as soon as we're finished with the other three presentations. So thanks, Akilah. We'll invite Valini
No
Leitch
problem.
to share her experience on this issue. Carlotta, are you ready?
Yes, good evening. Yes, I'm ready.
Good evening.
If you are.
Thank you. Yes, we are.
So I was go. Thank you and good evening. I wanted to say to you that we're going to be discussing domestic violence, like Akilah started already, and I would like to invite you to take care of yourself, since I am aware the statistics that were quoted, 1 in 3 women, about 1 in 6 men. So I know we have online here this evening with us survivors of domestic violence and perpetrators of domestic violence. So if you're triggered in any way, if you feel levels of discomfort or heightened stress, maybe you can take a deep breath, you can have a glass of water, you can step away for a minute and then come back to the conversation. Domestic violence is rooted in power and control. And Akilah would have alluded to this in her presentation as well. It is not an anger issue. Oh, this person has anger management issues. It's not. It is, yes, they may have anger management issues, but it is rooted in power and control, where one partner is using power and control to have their way and to subject the other partner. So it is a pattern of behavior that is used to maintain that power and control. And there are certain things that in a power and control relationship, like the use of isolation, the use of emotional abuse, and the use of intimidation, that is rife for this situation we find ourselves in called COVID-19. Because when you have social issues and like this global pandemic, it will put certain people at risk for violence. And the access, the reduced access to resources, the increased stress that comes about as a result of the job loss possibly, or strained finances, or the disconnection from social support causes immense issues in cases of intimate partner violence or just family violence as a whole. So when we talk about, we're having here in Guyana a partial lockdown of sorts, and we're having what we call our quarantine, and that helps or facilitates an abuser or a perpetrator to use strong isolation tactics. And let's look at most of us in Guyana, we have maybe a family of 5, 6. Sometimes we have extended families living with us. And now we're all in a similar space, a small space for 24 hours, especially if you have the concept of non-essential workers in your home or living space. Now, when people, more often than not, a lot of people here in our community, especially people who are marginalized, the space is small or not enough for people to engage in over a long period of time. In cases where you would have been able to change settings, we cope well because you may have a very tense living arrangement, rife with domestic violence, power and control issues, but then you're able to leave to go to work, you're able to leave for social gatherings, you're able to leave to go to do grocery shopping. And so you're able to use space in such a way that you reduce contact and reduce conflict. But when because of COVID-19 and our precautionary measures that we're taking, we're not able to use space in such a way to provide safety. Things like, so the buffer is removed. And then we do not have, in some cases, alternative activities, or we're unable to conceptualize those, like maybe putting the children in a car and going for a drive and come back, walking in the neighborhood, but just doing alternative things, going to a party, going to the National Library, going maybe to the seawalls, but being able to do alternative things. The other thing, the physical distancing. Here again, the abusive partner is able to use isolation, because generally a person who is exercising power and control, they tend to determine how you use your time, where you go, your access to your friends and your family. Now, physical distancing is already also telling us when we can go, where we can go, who we can access, and a perpetrator uses that as well. So they say to you, well, where are you gonna go? Lots of things that are uncomfortable and highly stressful is happening, but you are unable to respond in a way that you may have considered in the past because you're unable to leave. You are unable to access your family, so you can't stay a night over there. You can't go to your friends because everyone is concerned about contracting the disease. So again, the isolation that comes with your precautionary measures, that isolation is weaponized against a victim or a survivor. And then we talk about the access. I know Akilah mentioned that courts are working shortened hours, are using technology to hear cases, but a lot of people are afraid to go to the police station. They're not, maybe the courts cannot hear as many cases as they may want to. Applying for protection order, maybe taking a longer time than is normal. And so again, because we are under this pandemic and these precautionary measures, these same measures are being weaponized by perpetrators or abusers. So the lockdown and the quarantine is being used for isolation, the physical distancing, and then the essential services. Here again, Remember Maslow's law, the hierarchy of needs. Your basic needs you need to meet. And if you are not an essential worker, and so your job is closed and they have either laid you off, or you're attracting a cut in pay, a reduced pay, then you have issues of financial stability, you have food insecurity issues, and now there is a lot of stress in the family that's causing some friction, and then the person with the power is now using that to abuse and to control. What about children who are not able to go to school, nor are they able, and even if they are able, because they go to a private school and now they have access to an education through Zoom or whatever technology is used. But a lot of times the parents themselves do not have the capacity or the level of education to assist in homeschooling. And so that in itself causes more tension. I've heard cases where children are complaining that their parents don't understand, and the parents are saying it has to be done this way. And then the violence starts because the children are hit, their books are thrown around the place, the books are torn because the parent is feeling extremely insecure. They're unable to meet a need, and then they have a lot of frustration and they take it out on the children or the person with the power. More often than not, the male figure in the home takes it out on the female person in the home, and then that female person takes it out on the children. So it's a cycle. And so these issues around essential services, not able to work, not able to meet your daily, the basic needs, causes a problem. The children, their protective factors are removed. What I mean, children can go to their grandmas to escape home, because home is not always a safe haven. For some of us, that's a concept. For anytime you want to feel safe, you go home. You're happy there, things are provided for you, you're loved, you're protected. But for some of us, that is not a reality. Home is not a safe haven. So when children are unable to go to school every day, that protective factor is removed. And so they're stuck at home in a very volatile environment where people are screaming and cursing and hitting, and their world is just not right. Children are able sometimes to go visit grandma. So when things are happening at home, they go down the block or down the back of the yard to visit grandma. But now grandma is high risk because she has high blood pressure or diabetes. And so grandma is not accepting visitors. Even the grandchildren are not allowed. And now that protective factor is also reduced or removed. Children run over to the neighbor's house, but now the neighbors are scared. And so the neighbors are not accepting visitors either. What about food? Sometimes, I'm sure all of us, if we're Guyanese or lived in Guyana, of the concept of at dinner time, you bring two of your friends over, your mother always put up two more plates and everybody can eat. Or you go to your neighbor's house every dinner time so you can eat. But now that is not happening because we are unable to socialize as we are accustomed. So in homes, not only are we experiencing intimate partner violence, but children are also, if they're not witnessing violence, they are themselves experiencing violence because of this pandemic. Not that it wasn't so before, but it is even more pronounced as a result of the pandemic. Now, one moment, my slides are stuck. All right. So what can organizations or communities do, like IDPADA-G? What is the response? We have told you, well, yes, there is an increase I'm a clinical psychologist. I see clients, and I've had people talk to me about an increase in domestic violence for some of the reasons I've just outlined. Now, what can we do? So one of the things we need, like we're doing tonight, is an awareness campaign. We need education. We need to start talking some more about these issues around violence, power and control, talk to perpetrators like we're doing tonight, talk to victims and survivors like we're doing tonight. Education and awareness is key for prevention. The other thing is creating confidential spaces. A lot of survivors and victims are not able to leave their homes because of this partial lockdown. They don't quite know where to go. If you can have, in keeping, of course, being very aware of physical distancing, but if there's a place that someone can come, it's a public space, you know, they put on their mask and they sanitize and everything, but there's a place where they can just be for moments. That can be very useful for victims and survivors, just having a confidential, safe space. If it cannot be a physical space, then using technology can also help to create that confidential and safe space. If at all possible, having some hot meals like a pantry, just having a kitchen, not where people come to dine, but people can pick up a box. Children, families can get, and you're not catering for the entire Guyana, but you're choosing a population so that you can respond to a need in more holistic way. And if you have a kitchen that you can cook one meal per day and just serve these boxes, people can come in. That can help because a lot of people are experiencing food insecurity that is causing heightened levels of stress, which is a risk factor for violence. It's not the cause of violence, it's a risk factor. And then the therapeutic support for victims and survivors. Victims and survivors need a level of support where they can talk to someone and they can feel safe talking to someone. What are important perpetrator actions? If you are here and you can identify as a perpetrator of violence using power and control over your partner or even over your children or those who live in your household, you can learn self-regulation. At the beginning, I said that domestic violence and intimate partner violence is not an issue of because I have an emotional issues. I am angry, so that's why I do it. So even if you're angry, that's why you do it. Then you need to regulate, discover who you are, learn about yourself, and learn coping strategies that can help you to regulate your behavior. Become aware of the emotions, know when you're getting angry, right? Know when you're feeling this levels of discomfort and regulate. Then you can reach out for help. Help is available for you too. You can go to batterer's intervention, talk to people about your behavior and how you can get help. Take responsibility, hold yourself accountable for your actions. And then some actions for important actions for survivors. Take a break. Leave leave and go for a walk perhaps. Read a book. Take an extended shower if you can. When you go into the shower, take an extra 10 minutes just to be there to breathe, just taking care of yourself. All right. If at all, 10 minutes, I'll be right back. Go around the corner, take a walk, put on your mask and step outside. Do something to give yourself a little bit of space. Then connect with your families and your family and your friends. If you have a phone, texting, if you have, I know a lot of people, which is strange to some of us, but a lot of people there do not have Wi-Fi or internet connections and so at home. But ask a neighbor. You may feel very embarrassed, but ask the neighbor. Some people are kind and they may allow you access to their Wi-Fi so that you can remain in contact with your family and with your friend. Reach out for help. You know, abuse thrives in silence. Because you're isolated, because your power has been taken from you, because you have lost your voice, that person continues to abuse, using their power and using their control. But if you're able to speak with someone, I'm not saying the first time you talk with someone, the abuse will stop. It's not necessarily so. But just reaching out to someone. I have a number here and I had given it in my presentation, but it's one for help and shelter, 227-3454. 227-3454. That's a hotline that you can call. You can go online as well, and there are many overseas, a lot of overseas help that you can get, but you don't have to make a call. You can chat. So you do not need to expense yourself to first be able to call overseas. But if you have an internet connection already, you can go online and get that kind of help as well. And I know Akilah did give some numbers that I wrote as well, 640-1011, 640-1012. Then you can always call 911. You may not want to do that because you're afraid that because domestic violence is such a complex issue. If you call the police, the person who is battering you, you love that person. You don't love the battering, but you love them, and they're going to get arrested, and they're going to be thrown in the lockup for a day or so before they go before the court, and we will feel responsible for them being before the court when it's their own action that has caused that. But if you really feel unsafe, you can't get family or friends to help, you're unable to leave the home, you can call 911. You can go to the courts and get a protection order that will prohibit that person from further abusing you. They may even be excluded from the family residence so that you and the remaining household members can continue to live there in peace. So in the interest of time, I want to leave my presentation there. I want you to remember, if you are a victim or a survivor, you are not alone. There are so many of us who have experienced domestic violence. There's so many of us who have experienced intimate partner violence, and break your silence when you are ready. Help is always, always available. Help is always available. You are not alone. Thank you for your participation, and I will take your questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you so very much, Carlotta, for that. We'll invite Valini to share her experience.
So, good night, everyone. Again, to Kobe and the rest of the IDPADA-G team, thank you for having me. During this COVID-19 lockdown, it brought a lot of things out as a domestic violence survivor. I am happy to report at this point in time, I'm no longer a mother erased. I am now able to see my daughter and communicate with her more frequently. As a victim, now survivor, we oftentimes say, well, okay, why stay? Why you endure for so long? But many times we as victims, we deal with a number of challenges and issues. One is shame, because many times we don't want people to know that we are being beaten at home is something we feel, well, if we share it with someone, we're going to be criticized and people would think less of us. Two, you many times think about what happens to the children or the child. For me, I told myself, well, okay, I'm going to stay until my daughter reaches a certain age, and then I'm going to exit. I can say that I am one of the lucky ones. We have seen in recent times how many women would have died at the hands of their abusers. Fast forwarding now to COVID-19, this is a really touchy situation. I can only imagine women who are now victims, what they're going through. Because many times your abuser try to lock you in. The first thing they do, they isolate you from friends and family. So you would find if you would call your parents twice per week, they're going to ask, why must you speak with your parents twice per week? What is so important? They suddenly have problems with your friends. They see people who are close to you as threats, and then they kind of start to weave stories as to why you shouldn't be friends with this person and why this person isn't good enough for you to associate with. In this situation, imagine being unable to get out there to get essential supplies. Many abusers use the financial aspect to hold the victim in. Now, you're already limited in terms of going out. When you need things, you have to resort to asking the abuser. Many times they would say, well, okay, if you need this, you have to do this in return. Hello? Yes. Other than that, it is not easy getting out. You feel a sense of entrapment. You think about he's going to find me where I am. There is always built up fear. You always have to be looking over your shoulder as to, oh my God, if I talk to my neighbor, will he snap? I heard Miss Boodie talking about asking your neighbor for a Wi-Fi password. Could you imagine there are some women who cannot even go to their neighbor or even have a conversation with their neighbor? Some abusers are so technologically savvy that they track every movement you make, both physically or via your device. So while I might call neighbor Pat and ask her for her Wi-Fi password or explain to her why I need her Wi-Fi password, husband Jones is already either hearing this or listening to the or recording the text message right away. That's a recipe for disaster. So now, in the interest of time, I would like to share what, in layman's terms, what are some of the little tips that I use to go through my battle, and now for someone in this situation, how it will help you to cope. First off, step outside. When you realize things are getting heated, take a break. If you could, step outside. Take a walk, cool head, call a friend. you know, ground yourself. You need that sort of grounding. 2, pick your battles. Put yourself first and choose which arguments are safe. I know it's hard sometimes, but if the person is picking and nagging and being verbally abusive, the better thing to do is not respond. Call friends and family when you can. This is very important. Use the opportunity when you go to the bathroom to give a quick call or to text, just to let somebody know that you're alive, you are well, and so on. Get headphones on deck, because this research has found also that music reduces stress. And you know, it improves your mood and it increases sleep and all of that. So make yourself a playlist of your favorite music. So when your abuser might want to hurl harsh words at you and so on, resort to your headphone. Just plug it in there, listen to your music, relax, not worry with him. Prioritize alone time. This is very important. And for many women, myself included, my alone time was in the shower. So if you know you usually take a 10-minute shower during this time, add 5 minutes more. It not only soothes you, but it's your self-care, self-thinking time. If you have children, spend more time with them. Do little activities together, because you know it's already tense with the adults. You do not want to create an even tenser situation with the children, and they have to witness it. So you try to do little projects, spend more positive quality time with them. Journal. Make a note, date, time of everything that would have happened. So let's say on May 7th, he hit you with a spoon. Get your little notebook down. May 7th, hit with a spoon in the kitchen around this time. So when that time comes, or you have the opportunity to go and file a report, or you're going to get access to justice, you have all your information documented. Even though I am out of my abusive relationship, I still have my journal. I still have my journal of abuse I suffered from since 2014. Also, journaling your thoughts. This helps because it helps you to write your feelings, exactly how you feel at that time, what you're going through. If you have children, you try to make positive notes about your children, future plans you have for yourself, dreams you have, things you want to accomplish. So the journaling helps you to offload as well. Make a secret ready to go bag. Even if every time you have a little $100 or $500, put it aside. Always have your secret stash, that anytime you're ready to go, you have a little something to go with. Your ready to go bag must have your important documents. ID, passport, your birth certificate. If you have children, documents for them also. clothing and so on, you can always access that. And you have this, you can either keep it at home, or if you have a good friend or relative, you can ask them to keep it. So if the situation becomes volatile or really dangerous and you have to run, you have a little something in place. So pretty much these are tips as to how you can survive, not, I don't want to say survive COVID, but be prepared to handle these situations as they arise. There are a number of organizations that you can reach out to for help. There is Help and Shelter. There is the Domestic Violence Unit. Also, SASA Guyana, through its Community Paralegal Services Initiative, has some services that victims of gender-based violence can access. And these are mental health and counseling services, as well as pro bono legal and paralegal services. Even though remotely, you can reach to us on social media or on telephone number 623-5155, and we will be able to document your situation and help. So this is it for me. Any questions, please feel free to ask in the chat. Kobe?
Thank you so much, Valini. Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you so much for sharing, but also thank you for your strength. I think we really, I want to take a leap to say, I want to speak on behalf of all the participants to say that we really celebrate you. And you're quite right when you said that you are one of the lucky ones, because we've lost so many of our women to senseless killings. Just to also piggyback on what Carlotta was saying, and even what you said, domestic violence is about gender, it's about power, but I also think it's about abuse of power, because power in a lot of ways, it can be used to uplift and empower. um, and we also find that in a lot of these instances, the perpetrators don't use their power to uplift and empower. They actually use it to bring down, to kill, to meme, to slap, to beat. And that's something that we must continue to speak up against, but also to offer support. So thank you so much for that, Valini. Lastly, but certainly not the least, I'd like to invite our public health expert, Mr. Nicholas Elliot, to share with us.
All right. Good night, Kobe. Thank you so much. So my name is Nicholas Elliot. I'm not quite an expert as yet, but hopefully I'll get there. All right. So I'd like to start by saying that I'd like to start by saying that this pandemic that we're seeing right now is not it's not by any means the first pandemic, because I think for me that domestic violence has always been some sort of a pandemic, but it's been a silent, insidious pandemic. We haven't spoken too much about it. So, I mean, if you look at the time frame that people have been abusing other people compared to the amount of time frame that we have given public relevance to domestic violence, it's a bit disheartening. So Ms. Dorris and Ms. Boodie and our other speaker went through some of the of how the vulnerable groups can interact with their abusers and the abuse, and what role the environment has to play in all of this. But for the medical community, domestic violence and the issues of domestic violence, such as the outcomes that I'll explore later on, were not officially recognized until the 1900s, about 1994, which is also quite sad. And the those impacts are so profound and so expansive that 10 minutes would not be enough time to explore all of them. But I'll try to the best of my abilities. And if anyone has any questions, then we're going to be able to explore those afterwards. So when you look at the prognosis or the outcome of victims of domestic violence, they are almost 3 times more likely to suffer from a range of medical issues ranging from broken limbs, which are the things you can see and feel, to mental health problems, which are the things we can't see and can't feel. And unfortunately, even suicide or homicide, which is when they're not even there to appreciate anything. And so I would like to start my examination by looking at the youngest among us, which are the newborns and the infants. And what research has found, and this is actually documented medical knowledge, that adequate and appropriate social stimulation has an important factor to play in not only the psychological development of a child, but also the physical development. And so we can see that newborns and infants that have been exposed to abusive environments stand the risk of poor physical growth. And depending on how extreme that poor physical growth is, it can be termed as something called failure to thrive, which is a medical condition that is actually recognized by the WHO. And so due to that abusive environment and the poor physical growth, then they can be at risk for others. So if you're growing poorly, it means that you're now at risk for infections and diarrheas. And those infections and diarrheas can then put you at risk for more long-term complications. So we see that, not to downplay anything that an adult might go through, but children are in a uniquely vulnerable position in the sense that the outcome of domestic violence is not one that is immediate for them, but as they grow, more and more of this initial problem of violence tends to manifest. And we haven't even touched as yet on the physical injuries. Sorry, we haven't even touched on the physical injuries that they might endure, like the broken limbs. But fortunately, children tend to overcome physical injuries better, I guess, than adults, because their bodies are still growing, still changing. And so their bodies can basically remodel, which is take a scar, take a broken piece of bone and just grow over it and go as if nothing happened. And unfortunately, in adults, that's not necessarily the case. Right. So children, though they are resilient physically, they stand to have a lot of negative impact later on in their life. So that's it. Well, that's not it, but that's what I'd like to cover so far for children and the infants and neonates. And if we turn to look at the adolescents and the young adults, these impacts are then classified as primary or acute, or those more immediate impacts that you can see. And then the secondary impacts, which are the ones that might take a little longer to manifest, or they might manifest as a result of a previous injury, which would either be a previous physical or psychological trauma. So the physical outcome, so there are actually 4 that WHO classifies them as: the physical, mental, behavioral, and sexual and reproductive. So the physical traumas, those are the outcomes that the average person would be familiar with, the bruises, the puncture marks, the bites, the broken limbs. And they would also take into account secondary injuries that occur as a result of those. So let's say you might have a bruise in your head, but then 2 or 3 days later, you develop bleeding within the brain. So then that bleeding within the brain is a secondary injury, secondary physical injury as a result of that violent encounter. Persons with victims of domestic violence are also about 2 times more likely to suffer from chronic pain syndromes or persistent pains. So after an injury has healed, they are more likely to feel pain in that area. And some say the pain is psychological, some say the pain is actually physical, but there's no hard evidence of that. But what we do know is that they tend to complain of a lot of physical and persistent pain. So that's more for the physical category. Moving on to the mental category, this would include the depression, stress, and anxiety associated with abuse. And the secondary impact would, you would not believe what's an important secondary impact is memory loss. So about 1/3 of victims of domestic violence tend to suffer from memory loss. Associated with that, they would also have poor self-esteem and attempts at self-harm or even suicide. The third would be behavioral changes, and those behavioral changes tend to surround substance abuse and risky activities. And the fourth is sexual and reproductive. So that most common in the category is sexual and reproductive are unwanted pregnancies. And according to the WHO, again, these occur between 5 and 17% of cases of sexual assault. Also, you would find that persons, because of unwanted pregnancies, would tend to have frequent abortions. And a lot of these times, these abortions are done using unsafe methods and disbanded practices. But they tend to go towards these because of the stigma attached with actually having an abortion, for one, and two, the stigma attached to the initial activity of being abused. So they may feel uncomfortable presenting to a care facility saying, I have been abused, I am now pregnant, and I do not want this. Guyana is one of the few countries in the Caribbean where abortions are actually legal. In some countries, it's punishable by imprisonment. So I think that has a lot to do with the stigma surrounding that. For males that have been abused, decreased libido and erectile dysfunction is exceedingly common. And just turning back a bit to the females and the younger females, they tend to have traumas of the reproductive tract because their bodies have not physically reached that mature level where they can cope with sexual activity. And so, as I mentioned earlier, children are resilient, children can heal. But what you would find is that as a result of that initial trauma when they were younger, the reproductive tract is unable to cope with a pregnancy, or it's unable to take a pregnancy to full term. So they, again, would have a lot of miscarriages when they become older. And that's just another one of the ways that being exposed to violence as a child can affect a person way up into their 30s and 40s. Right. So there are a number of signs which may cause a healthcare professional to become concerned that a patient is currently in an abusive situation or has been exposed to an abusive situation for a very long period of time. But figures suggest that only 1 in 6 patients in a clinic is actually screened for domestic violence. So let's say 6 persons walk in, the clinician is only likely 1 in those 6 times to ask this patient if this illness that you're presenting with, most times from one of the 4 categories I mentioned, is likely to be the result of an abusive situation. So there is some work to be done in the part of the clinicians. However, some of these other indicators have been documented and others rely on the intuition of the clinician as just a human, you know? And so some of the things that are documented are the combination of injuries, the pattern of injury, the frequency of the injury, and almost at the top of the list is the information we get after we take the history from the patient. So the history is that bit of the interview when the patient first presents and you ask them, you know, the doctor interacts with them, asks them some questions, and these questions are structured. But if the clinician, for some reason, as I mentioned earlier, based off the combination of the injuries, they see the pattern or the frequency, they can get the suspicion that this is due to an assault of some sort. And so in taking their history, they would not only be observing your response and documenting your response, but they will also be documenting the responses of the persons that are accompanying you and making note of who are these persons that are accompanying you. Right. And one thing that we struggle with is that when you take the history, patients who have been exposed to domestic violence, they tend to be ashamed to speak in the presence of their partner, or in the case of children, a guardian that has been abusing them. But if you ask them the same series of questions, in the absence of that factor, you might get a different result, which would then warrant some sort of intervention. So the big question is, what are the interventions that the healthcare system is doing to actively mitigate this issue? And I don't have all of the answers, but I do have some of those things. And to begin, it starts with being able to identify the problem. And so in this regard, healthcare professionals are constantly being trained either throughout medical school or their courses that you can do after graduating to sharpen the ability of healthcare professionals to recognize the issues of domestic violence much quicker. And that's the first big step. And once it's been recognized, departments have been equipped with access to social work, which is most of what has been talked about earlier. that would then be offered. So you have counseling services as well as other support mechanisms that departments are equipped with. And if in some instances, you may have access to financial aid, depending on the availability and the access to those institutions. I know the Ministry of Social Cohesion, as well as Ministry of Indigenous Peoples Affairs would usually offer some amount of financial aid. Right. So there's a maxim that the children are the future. And so this is where I know that the pediatrics department takes this very seriously. And so any case of domestic violence towards children is often treated as top priority, serious business. And they would insist that before that child is scheduled to be discharged, so let's say that child came for a pneumonia or some sort of infection, let's say it's going to take 14 days for this infection to be adequately treated, they will insist that by day 10, that child must have been seen and must make contact with social work department, and those parents must be counseled by that day 10. So you have some time for the social work department to then review that patient and make further recommendations, whether it might warrant the intervention of another agency for financial aid or even the police or whatever. But they do insist that before that child is scheduled to be discharged, that child must have been, and the parents or guardian must have been counseled. I know the other departments like Obs and Gynae, which deals with pregnancies and women's issues, and surgery, they're also no stranger to social work or police intervention once they see it to be necessary. But what I can say is that this is a huge problem. And victims of domestic violence overall are less likely to seek primary care facilities, such as going to your health centers. So one statistic actually said that less than half of victims of domestic violence are likely to visit the health center annually to get an annual checkup. And this includes antenatal visits like pregnancies. So when they're pregnant, they're less likely to actually visit the clinic. And so we can see that this already can result in a poor outcome, because if you're not visiting a clinic when you're pregnant, how do you keep track of that pregnancy and development of that baby? The report also suggests that only 1 in 5 victims of domestic violence is likely to seek screening for different types of cancers. So, and that includes mammograms. So that would mean that every 4 out of 5 victims of domestic violence is likely to discover a disease until it has progressed too late, or until the impact of that disease or the morbidity associated with that disease would be so significant that it would negatively impact the quality of life that patient can have. Right. So even though these patients are less likely to have these sort of primary checkups, they're about 3 times as likely, and in some instances, 6 times as likely to have emergency room visits. So you can see that even though they hardly go for checkups, they go for things that are serious and can be potentially life-threatening. And though these things are life-threatening, they are avoidable. And that's the bottom line. And so I'd like to end by encouraging everyone in an abusive situation to take some form of help or therapy so that they can learn positive coping mechanisms that they can use during this time to be lifted from that situation. I'm encouraging victims so that they can recover as best as possible, and so that they can not continue that cycle, because many times you find children or partners that have been abused may tend to become abusers, and that's the sad part of the cycle. And I'm encouraging the perpetrators, because I mean, they are largely the problem, right? And so if they can seek some sort of help, if you are a perpetrator of domestic violence and you realize that I can change, you need to realize that they can change, right? Then hopefully that by them reaching out to social services and getting some counseling and some therapy and the appropriate treatment, then they would not continue to abuse others. So that's my take, and hopefully it was useful in some way. if any you have any questions, I'm willing to take those afterwards.
Thank you, Nicholas. And I want to say that it was very much useful because in a lot of cases, when we talk about domestic violence, we talk about it from a social justice, human rights perspective, and we miss the part where it's actually a public health risk and a threat to public health. So it was really good for you to bring that perspective to us. And I know that we would have garnered something from it to know that health is important, is actually a human right. And if it is that persons are beating or causing harm, then that's actually a threat to people's human rights, who they actually are. So thank you so much for that, Nicholas. I know we've had a
You're most
long
welcome.
time for, pardon? Yes. I know
I said
we've
you're
had a
most
long,
welcome. Sorry.
yes. I know we've had a long time with presentations, and I love that some persons have been using the parking lot or the group chat to ask questions and to comment. And so before I invite persons to raise their hands to ask questions, I think it's best for us to look at the parking lot to respond to some of these. And some of the questions were actually, even though they don't have names, they were actually typed when persons were speaking. So the first question was for Akilah, and that was from Tanisha. She was asking, from the survey, which ethnic group is mostly affected? Akilah, can you respond to that?
Thank you, Tanisha, for asking that question. And thank you to my other colleagues who presented. I think that this conversation definitely needs to continue beyond just this initial Zoom call. For the survey focused primarily on certain periods, the women's lifetime experiences with violence, as well as their current experience. And current experience meaning within the last 12 months at the time that the survey was being done. And we recognized that there wasn't a statistically significant difference between the ethnicities. Anything significant enough to talk about. I know there has been a lot of conversation around, oh, domestic violence happens in a particular community with a particular set of people. We did not see that happening. It was across the board. However, we noted that when it came to sexual abuse at any age, we found that that was statistically significant because overall, we found that women in the hinterland communities reported sexual abuse at any age at twice the rate of women in urban settings. And that translated to about 28% versus 28% of the women in hinterland areas versus 14% of women in urban areas. So to answer that question, there wasn't a statistically significant difference between the ethnicities. We recognized that intimate partner violence, it occurred across the board. And we saw the diversity of the experiences coming from the various ethnic groups. And I can be happy to share a copy of the entire report with you, Kobe, so that I can share the entire survey report with you so you can disseminate it to your network.
Okay, great. We would definitely love that, Akilah. Thank you so much. And don't mute your mic as yet because we have another question for you. And so Trudy is asking, since it is believed that gender-based violence may be or could be an emerging issue due to the current emergency situation, does the unit have an awareness program in place currently or in mind to bring attention to this issue?
Thank you for that question, Kobe. Most definitely. However, we're currently affected like many other entities because you may be aware that the majority of programs we embarked on had to do with dissemination via radio, via television. And we're still working on developing a comprehensive plan. And I must say that the National Task Force to the Prevention of Sexual Violence is the body that is legally constituted to develop a national plan that addresses sexual violence in Guyana, and will also be addressing issues of domestic violence and gender-based violence. We produced posters, particularly in brochures, and we've disseminated those. And we started this social media campaign. So if you visit our website, mosp.gov.gy, you can get information there. We also have our Facebook page, both the Ministry of Social Protection, as well as the Child Care and Protection Agency, as well as the Sexual Offenses and Domestic Violence Policy Unit. We've been using those platforms to reach persons. We have not had a significant presence in the local newspapers. Of course, everything comes with a cost at this time. Not that we're making that a hindrance, but that is the reality that we're facing. But we are working on a program. We have reached out to our partners within our networks to support this. And, of course, that's why we jumped at the opportunity to participate in this mechanism here, this forum here, to ensure that we get this information out. But we've been doing quite a bit, and we will continue to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Akilah. So we have another question that was from Prince Mystique. I think this question was directed to Carlotta, and Prince was asking, what if they won't allow you to call? Once you share your story, it shows that the survivors, they aren't alone, and encourage them to help. Carlotta, do you want to respond to this one? Prince is asking, what if they won't allow you to call?
Yeah, thanks, Prince. Thanks, Kobe. It's really, domestic violence is a very complex issue, and there is no one plaster for all the sores, right? So the victim or the survivor understands their experience, and if they're not able to make a call, then they wouldn't, and they will use other opportunities of other methods to connect. So depending on what's happening, you use your own process and do what works for you if you're not allowed to call. But if you need to seek help, find a way. Because I worked in the domestic violence field for many years, I've had an experience with a friend who, we just set up a code word so that if she would ever call me and say a certain thing, it would make absolutely no sense to another person listening, but for the abuser, he thinks it's a regular conversation. Are you gonna make the cake for us tomorrow? Something like that. And I know, I need to call 911. I need to call the police. I need to tell them that, look, she has an order, whatever. For other people, they do different things. Like for your children in the house, if you say to the children, X, Y, and Z, they know, okay, we need to be quiet. We need to come. We're all going to come and watch TV. If mommy say, okay, everybody come, we're doing, and they understand what it is. For people with a safety plan, they know that it's Friday. This partner, this father, this abuser will be drunk when he comes home. This is going to happen. And so they have these words, they have things that they say. So, if I ever say this, you get away as quick as possible and run to the neighbor. So you have to use things that work for you. Just ensure that somebody knows what the code word is or what the things mean. Children at a certain age can understand. You're not trying to scare them, but you're saying to them, anytime you hear mommy say X, Y, and Z, then you need to get through the door or the window as quickly as you can and go X, Y, or Z place. So do what you can. And yes, silence. We generally say break your silence, but I have had an experience that I now tell people, Only break your silence when you think you are ready, when you have a supportive network, when you have a community to support you, because sometimes you break your silence and family members do not believe you. Your silence is inconvenient, and now you have additional pressure. So you very break your silence, because the abuse thrives on silence. But again, on the flip side of that, you may be putting yourself in even more danger by speaking up, or you can, be very demotivated because the people that you speak with, they do not believe you, and they put you at more risk when you break that silence. So do what works for you. I think Valini had alluded to that as well. Just your process and do what works for you.
Thank you, Carlotta. We have a question from Thalia. And Thalia, I think this question was directed to Akilah. And Thalia was asking, since domestic violence victims are now allowed to go directly to the magistrate's court with their case, has there been any feedback or statistics on the effectiveness of this system since its implementation?
The immediate response to that question will be no. We have not done any sort of assessment of such a mechanism. And it was just today we had our weekly meeting with the National Task Force. And the National Task Force comprises a multi-sectoral body of professionals and sectors and agencies. And this is definitely, we did discuss it just today, and this is definitely an area that we will work towards. I just wanted to add a bit to what Carlotta said just now. Many times we assume that a victim is ready to leave an abusive relationship. And I think it was Valini who said that, persons ask, why don't you leave, and so forth. And because we are aware of what the statistics show, that when you leave, you got to leave for good. Because if you return, you run the risk of being further abused or even killed upon your return. So you have to be able to plan your escape. Carlotta spoke about safety planning and so on. You have to plan your escape. And in addition to the code words that you have with your friends, you may not even have telephone access. But we have to be able to look at violence or addressing domestic violence as everybody's business. We hear this ever so often. There needs to be an entire community involvement as it relates to responding to domestic violence. So for example, if your neighbor notices that they haven't seen you in a couple of days and all they're hearing are your screams, and all they're hearing is broken bottles and broken things and so on, they must be concerned enough, not necessarily to come over to your door and knock, because that could further compound the problem, but they must be concerned enough to work out a response, maybe with other community members, contact the local police, find a way to get the perpetrator or the abuser out the house as a distraction, so that you get some time to contact the police or you get some time to run for assistance. So you have to be strategic. You have to be able to plan. Valini did talk about, even during the good times, even when things are going good, you make sure you have copies of your important documents, because that's one of the things perpetrators try to withhold from you. So make sure that you have a copy in a trusted place. So even if the ones that you have at home, they're destroyed and they're held, well, then you know that you don't have to start over from scratch. And the Ministry of Social Protection, through our Probation and Social Services Department, can provide support to you as it relates to planning your escape or safety planning. We also provide court support services. So you don't have to go to the magistrate's court by yourself, but we're not able to intervene if we're unaware, all right? If we're unaware of a situation happening. And when we talk about trusted persons, it could be a trusted religious leader. It could be a trusted community member. it could be a trusted colleague, and it's important. You know, I mean, we may not want persons or employers, for example, to know what's going on in our private life and so on. But when it comes to saving us, we may need to alert our employer. That may be our only escape. So we need to be strategic and plan our escape. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Akilah. Thanks for that. Now I'll invite persons to raise their hands. Not literally your hand, but the option. If you'd like to make, a short comment or a directed question to one of our panelists. And I'll ask my colleagues to help with uh, re- releasing the hands so you can ask your question. In the meantime, though, Akilah, and since you work with the government, I would hope that you can shed some light. We talk a lot about domestic violence and so on, but I don't think as a movement, we really engage men and boys a lot, because a lot of in all cases, most cases, they're the ones who are responsible and need to be held accountable. What can we do as a society, as a culture, as an ecosystem, to really change toxic masculinity and really rigid masculinity in young men and boys? Because I can remember a couple of years ago, I went to a school. I won't say the school's name to single out a school, but I went to a school to do a session on comprehensive sexuality education, and we were talking about violence against women. And this young man, he was not older than 11. He was like 10, because he was like 11 because he was like in first form. And we were talking about violence and respecting women. He turned to his colleague and he said, his colleague was female, actually. And he said, why should I respect her? If she misbehaves, she gotta get it. And I said, wow, really? What do you mean by that? I said, what happens at home? If your mother, misbehaves, what do you think should happen? He said, so if she misbehaves, she gotta get it tough. And I mean, I was shocked by that. I was shocked by that response, but I don't blame the young man for his position, because I don't know what goes on in his home. I don't know if he sees that sort of violence being portrayed. But so how can we, as a family, as a culture, as a society, change that? And what can be the government's response, um, with the help of civil society? What can we do as a society to help that?
Thank you so much, Kobe. And I'm very glad that you're thinking in the direction of not just government bearing the responsibility to address the issue, but rather you're taking ownership. And we have to take ownership of helping to address domestic violence. We've recognized that we have to be able to start at a very early age. And we have to be able to work closer with parents, particularly those parents who might be struggling, who might be experiencing challenges and difficulty, whether they might be a single parent, whether they might be experiencing poverty. We must be able to provide support to them, and they must be willing also to reach out for assistance when they face these challenges. The other thing, Kobe, we have to be able to condemn all forms of violence. We cannot condemn violence directed towards women by men. And I want to make it very clear that men are not the only perpetrators of violence and physical violence. That is, women are also perpetrators of physical violence. Children are also perpetrators of physical violence. We have children who are verbally and physically abusive to their parents. We have family caregivers who are abusive towards the elderly persons, right? So we condemn when violence is directed towards women, but we condone women beating their children as a form of punishment. So, and that's where, you know, the problem lies. Violence begets violence, and we have to condemn it at all levels, regardless of the perpetrator. Toxic masculinities are also reinforced via media, among other mediums. And we have to be able to take a stand. It's a personal choice, as well as it's a community choice and response. It's a societal choice and response in terms of what we accept as okay to be shared in the public domain. Much of what our boys learn, they learn it through society. They learn it through the various agents of socialization. So we have to go back to the cradle. We have to go back to where the problem originated. And we have to start re-socializing parents. And the collaboration can extend beyond for example, the Child Protection Agency doing parenting programs with parents, but even within the health facilities, when mothers come to clinics and so forth with their children, that space, that opportunity can be provided for them to share information, to reinforce the positive parenting and the positive messages. I strongly believe that men and boys also need to get a space where they themselves can express, you know, their challenges and express their frustrations. And that's part of the problem. Not that it should be accepted as a reason for abuse, but we have to be able, you see, we've socialized our boy children differently from our girl children. So we have a lot of pressure cookers waiting to explode. So we have to relook at the various agents of socialization and try to penetrate it through that. And I'm seeing Debbie, she's asked a question about the collaborative plan in place that our unit and the police has. Now, the Guyana Police Force, they're the only legal authority whom can respond to a domestic violence emergency. And what do we mean by a domestic violence emergency? If someone's life is is threatened, it is only the police by law, unless it involves a child. And of course, the police also has to become involved in that situation. But where it comes to adults, it's only the police can report to a domestic violence disturbance. So if the police is unaware, they're not able to report. However, there are facilities in place. Once you get to the police station and you're unable to return home to that place, the Ministry of Social Protection and our partners, Help and Shelter and Red Thread, can facilitate arrangements to ensure that you're provided with temporary accommodations, that you and your dependents, once your dependents are under the age of 14 years, and dependents referring to your children, we can facilitate transporting you and caring for you at one of our safe spaces, our shelters, or our homes. So I just wanted to reiterate that point. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Akilah. Thank you. That was very much useful. Thanks. We have another question. This is from Prince, and he's directing it to any one of the presenters. He's asking, how can you reach out to a male survivor that may be embarrassed to say something during the lockdown? Men are always known to be tough and always show they're strong and not cry. So anybody could take that one.
And so we're coming back to the same question you were asking about toxic masculinity. And, you know, where we glorify this stoic and strength and virility and dominance. So we talk to our boys and we start to tell them, you know, don't cry, don't allow them to show emotions. Big boys don't cry, tough it out. And so they're unable to express only anger. Every emotion, they express it as anger. What are you feeling? They're angry, but it's more than that. It's not necessarily anger. And sometimes what we see is that violence is normalized. You know, someone was asking about, I think it was you, Kobe, talking about the boy saying, but I'm gonna slap her, or my, it's just, it's that the violence and this kind of behavior is normalized, and we need community actions in our faith community, in our schools, in all the community groups and so on, to start a new conversation so that we do not continue to accept, we challenge the systems, we challenge the culture that condones and that encourages the music, you know, to sit and start to look at what we hear through our music, through social media, just constantly having these conversations because we normalize this behavior. This is what we see now happening in society, that the smallest person is thinking that violence is the answer, or a woman should remain quiet, and if she steps out the line, I'm going to slap her, or I'm going to do whatever. We need to have, allow boys and men to experience and to express a wide range of emotions, not only anger. So I would say to Prince, let them know that it's all right to feel. Let them know that it is not their fault that they're being abused. Let them know that domestic violence, anyone can be abused, and there is no excuse, and it's not their fault. They can also reach out for help if they need that help.
And if I can jump in, thank you so much, Carlotta. You've said it so beautifully. And I would just like to add that what the Ministry of Social Protection is currently, what has been our experience is that a lot of men are tired with women talking to them. They're tired of women talking to them. And if you look in terms of the service providers, the GBV, the DV service providers, mostly are women, right? Because mostly women take up the quote unquote, the caring jobs. So some men, they just don't want to hear from a woman because they feel that we're biased. You know, they feel that we don't understand what they're experiencing because we're not a man. So what we're embarking upon, and I know Help and Shelter has started this process many moons ago, is to have male facilitators who can function as counselors. And so men get men have men that they can embrace and they can, you know, have society with, and they can lean upon. And I think it's important for us to provide that space. Young men should have male mentors, you know, whom they can look up to, who model the kinds of behaviors and masculinities that we desire. So we have embarked on a process of engaging men from all sectors to be able to function in this capacity. And we've received good feedback for now, particularly from our religious communities, where they're willing to provide this kind of support to men in distress. So that's definitely an area that we want to look at. And quickly before we end, I just would like to say that many times a lot of pressure is placed on the victim. The victim has to be the one to get the strength. The victim has to be the one to keep it together for the family. The victim has to be the one to leave the house with all the children when the perpetrator gets to stay in the luxury. Right? So I think we need to include in our conversation as well that of perpetrator accountability. Of course, we desire a society where even perpetrators can be rehabilitated, they can be reformed and transformed. This is what we desire, but we need to also begin the conversation on perpetrator accountability and ensure that the victim doesn't have to have the added burden to leave and the perpetrator gets to stay. But of course, we know there are a lot of things attached to that. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akilah and Carlotta. I think you guys really summed it up nicely as to how do we really tackle this. I wished we had a lot more time, but we don't. We've actually exceeded the time for this conversation, and it's actually a good thing that we've exceeded it, because it really shows that these are the conversations we need to have. These are the spaces that we need to promote, and I hope that the conversation does not end and would end here. We would ask you, because I know that Akilah and even Carlotta would have presentations that they would like to share. If you would like to have uh, copies of those presentations, if you can send us your email addresses to our Facebook page, the IDPADA-G Youth Committee's page. If you can send your email addresses there, we can share that with you. Because we do feel that, you know, you can then go into your youth circles, not physically, you could have calls or even send it in your WhatsApp group and so on. But we can't keep the information here. We will be sharing the hotline numbers on our Facebook pages. And if you yourselves on your Facebook page, and even on your WhatsApp status, on your Instagram, I know that a lot of us would have those platforms. If you can share it there, because a lot of people um, would really like to benefit from those services and the support. So on behalf of the youth committee, on behalf of the IDPADA-G, I would just like to thank our wonderful presenters for participating. I think we really did have an excellent conversation about this issue that has been really grappling our life for decades and decades. I'd also like to thank our participants both on the Zoom meeting but also on Facebook Live. Um, Hopefully next time we'll take some questions from Facebook also if we have more time. Thank you to our technical folks who have been working behind the scenes. Thank you so much, and we hope that we can meet again. Join us next week for another topic we will be discussing. We share the information on that, but we hope that you can stay engaged with us as we uplift women and girls and everyone in Guyana. So thank you so much for joining.
Pleasure. Have a
Good
good
night,
night,
everyone.
everyone.
It's
Just
been a
before you
pleasure.
guys leave, I just want to encourage everyone to tune in next week to our next program. We're going to be having an impromptu speaking competition. So if you're interested in being a part of that, you can message us on the Facebook page, the IDPADA-G Youth Committee Facebook page, and indicate your interest. As well, we'll be having Terrence Isaac. He recently released a book titled You Are Your Biggest Critic. So he'll be coming on our program to share about his book. And then after he finishes, we'll have an impromptu speaking competition. So if you're interested, please indicate. We're going to be giving away prizes. So make yourself available for this program. I would like to thank all of our speakers. A wonderful and a rich conversation tonight. Unfortunately, we have to end. And I would like to thank everyone for tuning in yet again. And invite another friend next week, invite a family member. And let's continue to have these rich conversations. Don't forget to practice social distancing, adhere to all of the guidelines, all the health guidelines, and stay safe. So thank you very much for coming out tonight. Bye.
It's been a pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your evening.